If you combine Russia and Ukraine, they provide 25% of global exports of wheat, 35% global exports of barley. Russia provides a large percentage of global fertilizer exports. And if you look at it from the importing point of view, you say, okay, so Russia and Ukraine are 25% of the world's exports of wheat. It doesn't mean they grow that much wheat. It just means they export that much wheat. The U.S. grows more wheat, but we use it ourselves. We feed cows and pigs and make ethanol and do all kinds of other things with it. But Russia and Ukraine export a lot of it. But from the point of view of countries, you say, well, who gets their food from Ukraine and Russia? There you find countries get 75 to 90% of their food from those two places. And that includes countries like with large populations, Egypt, Sudan, countries in the Middle East, Kenya, and others, and many others. It's a long list. Yeah, I was going to say it's not just about price. There's money around. You can get subsidies, but starvation is a bigger problem. And they've been scrambling since the war started last February. To the extent they've been getting anything, they've been drawing down reserves from the year before. So there is grain storage, and there was some left. But now the reserve, and believe it or not, some of the exports are going to Europe, which has other resources. And so starvation is a real, you may end up with more people dying of starvation than dying in the war. But this is playing out in real time. I was not saying everything's happened right now. It's happening, and it's going to get worse as the winter progresses. So, for example, Boeing, they talk about the supply chain. Boeing gets, how do you make airplanes? Well, they make them from aluminum and titanium. Where's that come from? Well, about 40% of it comes from Russia. What about farmers in Argentina, farmers in Brazil, farmers in parts of the United States for that matter? How do you grow crops? Well, you need nitrogen fertilizer. Where does nitrogen fertilizer come from? A lot of it comes from Russia. So when you start throwing these sanctions, it's one thing to sit in a little bubble office in Washington and say, I'm going to throw this sanction on you or you and this. And it comes around, it boomerangs. And this is what I was teaching at the U.S. Army War College. And I had a lot of skepticism from the class. I have to admit, it was seminar style. It was only 12 people, the top mid-career big brains who are going to be future, 3 or 4-star generals, future national security advisors. That group are my class, as I say, at the mid-career stage. They were skeptical. That's fine. I encourage that. But I said, here are the sanctions. Here's what we're going to do. None of it's going to work. And it's going to be worse than that because it's going to boomerang and hurt us. And that's what I told them. And that's exactly what's happened. The Russian ruble, remember Joe Biden saying, we're going to crush the Russian ruble. The ruble today is stronger in foreign exchange markets than it was before the war, et cetera. So Russia's oil revenues are up. The quantity might be down, but the price was up from where it was. And so they're making more money. The foreign exchange reserves are fine. And by the way, 20% in gold. So you can't freeze the gold. You can freeze dollars, you can freeze treasury securities, but not the gold. So what could get worse than what we just described? And all this is continuing and getting worse, and that's a big factor for 2023. Unfortunately, we are on a path to nuclear war. And I studied nuclear war fighting beginning in the late 1960s. And what I studied in the late 1960s, most of it was written by scholars in the late 1950s. That was the early part of the Cold War, the early part of the nuclear age, when some big brains were working on this. They had different views on certain things, but they all said one thing: don't go there. And what they meant was avoid escalation. Nobody wakes up and says, hey, nice day for a nuclear war, I think I'll fire a missile. It's more the case that somebody does something, the other side retaliates, the first side raises the ante, the next side comes back, and you keep escalating, and you get to a point where finally somebody is trapped. They're like, okay, this is now existential. My country is at risk. My regime is at risk, etc. I'm thinking about shooting nuclear weapons. And here you get into game theory, a game theoretic approach, where the side that wasn't going to shoot first shoots first because they think the other side is going to shoot first. In other words, it's always better. First strike is always better than second strike. So if you think the other guy's going to shoot, then you shoot first, even though you didn't start out that way. And we saw a real world example of this in 1962 in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And what did Kennedy and Khrushchev do? They were going down this path. Everyone said, don't go there. And they de-escalated. Khrushchev pulled the missiles out of Cuba. U.S. pulled its missiles out of Turkey. U.S. promised not to invade Cuba. Some of this was known at the time, some not, but there were some quid pro quos, but we de-escalated, got through it. So between the scholarly approach, which I just talked about, and the practical application, which was the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's been understood ever since. Today, we have a very lightweight crowd, warmongers, people who don't understand what I just described, or if they do, they trivialize it, and they're throwing nuclear war fighting talking points around like they're candy canes or something, and they are escalating. We're doing exactly what you're not supposed to do, with the U.S. sanctions, but U.S. providing long-range artillery to Russia. U.S. and U.K. blow up the Nord Stream pipeline, blow up the Kerch Strait Bridge. Russia says, okay, gloves are off. We're taking down the power grid in the rest of Ukraine. The U.S. says, okay, here come the Patriot missiles. And Russia says, we'll take them out before you launch them because we got hypersonic missiles. We're doing exactly what everyone said not to do. We're heading for nuclear war. I don't know when cooler heads are going to prevail, but they may not. Now, let me just kind of give a quick background and I'll explain what China's doing and why it's going to fail and why it's a really, really big deal. For the last 3 years, they've been pursuing what's called the zero COVID policy. And zero COVID means what it says. So like if there's one person who gets infected, they quarantine you in your apartment, and using extreme measures in some cases. They've actually had teams come in hazmat suits and weld steel I-beams to the outside of your door so you couldn't get outside your apartment. If 7 or 8 people get it, they shut down a whole neighborhood. 30 people, they shut down a whole city. We're talking Shanghai, 26 million people, Beijing, 22 million people, and other cities, Xi'an, Chongqing. I've actually been to Wuhan, I've been to all these cities, and they're huge. Nobody in, nobody out. Or if you do, you have to have a negative COVID test, but it can't be more than 48 hours old. So you got to get tested 3 times a week. And they have testing tents every 3 blocks in the city, and masks and all. By the way, none of this stuff works, by the way, but they make you do it. They have COVID concentration camps where they ship people outside the city limits and put them in quarantine, etc. Extremely, extremely damaging to the economy. Can you contain the COVID? Yeah, but at a multi-billion-dollar cost, not to mention social disruption, etc. And it doesn't work in the long run. It can contain in the short run at enormous cost. Absolutely does not work in the long run. Well, but it was all done for political reasons because Chairman Xi Jinping wanted to get his 3rd term, unprecedented, by the way, since Mao Zedong, as the new emperor, the new communist emperor of China. So, he did. He got past. He got the 3rd term, and here we are. So they threw in the towel on COVID. They said, okay, we're just going to let it go, let it rip. They don't put it that way, but that's what they're doing. And they're saying, okay, now you can self-quarantine. You don't need tests. You don't need travel permissions. You can just go, but, be careful. Wash your hands, basically. So what's going to happen next? Everyone, and of course, Wall Street has always got the pom-poms out, the Wall Street cheerleaders, buy stocks, buy Chinese stocks. I wouldn't touch China with a 10-foot pole or maybe a 6-foot pole, since that's the social distancing range, which is another piece of medical nonsense, by the way. But so the bulls are saying, well, now get in China because they're reopening and they're going to get going. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen for 2 reasons. Number one, this thing's ripped. Now, the math is pretty simple. It's not complicated. It's a population of 1.4 billion people. Assume a 30% infection rate, which I think is conservative. A lot of estimates, some people say 50 to 60% before you achieve what they call herd immunity. But let's just say 30% to be on the conservative side. That's 420 million people are going to be infected with COVID in the coming months. The fatality rate is 0.25%, which is quite low, meaning 99.75% survival rate. Well, that's the good news. The bad news is 0.25% of 420 million is a million. You're talking about 1 million dead. And again, that's conservative. Some estimates, again, I've seen 1.5 million. 1.5 million dead, okay? But how many are in hospitals? How many are in ICU beds? They don't have the ICU beds. They have some, but they don't have nearly enough to. So it's not just a question of the fatality rates. It's a question of what can you do to offer medical treatment or any kind of assistance to the 400 million or more people who are infected. So first of all, that's going to shut down that's inevitable. That's the math. It's not speculation. That's going to do more damage to the economy than the lockdown. In other words, the zero COVID policy. In other words, China has no good way out. If you go zero COVID, you're going to cause a revolution and it doesn't work. If you let it rip, you got 1 million to 1.5 million dead.